Women and fiction. That is the topic of Virginia Woolf's famous essay, A Room of One's Own. And as a conservative Christian wife and mother in 2025, I'm still really glad that I read this book. It was really great food for thought. Hello friends, and welcome to my channel. My name is Haley and I am a Christian wife, homeschooling mother of 3, out to redeem my very own literary education, which means that I am encountering authors and classics and literature that I have never touched before. And for the first time, I am reading Virginia Woolf, who is an absolute feminine icon in the writing world. Now, I don't know a ton about Virginia Woolf before going into A Room of One's Own. I was kind of influenced to pick this up after reading Elizabeth and Her German Garden, written by Elizabeth von Arnim. When I read that afterword, written by Ulrich Baer, he mentioned how much Virginia Woolf loved Elizabeth von Arnim. She was a contemporary of her and likened her to Charles Dickens. But it was also mentioned that Elizabeth and Her German Garden was originally entitled A Garden of One's Own, because it was kind of about finding independence as a wife and a mother in that time within her garden. And I loved that book. And so when I saw that afterward reference Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, I kind of had it in the back of my head. And then I went to my local library and found a copy just browsing through the shelves. I saw that it was short, that it wasn't necessarily a book, but more a long essay. And I thought, you know what? I'll give it a shot. It's a library book. If I love it, great. If I don't, oh well, I didn't have to pay money for it. But I am really glad that I did choose to pick it up. Now, A Room of One's Own was published in 1928, and in Virginia Woolf's time, things were very different for women and women's rights. So while I often hear Virginia Woolf praised as a feminist, I don't necessarily think it's the same as what maybe the term for feminist would mean in 2025. In her time, women really did have a lot less rights than they do today. So I was very interested on her thoughts on writing and women and fiction, which is what she discusses in A Room of One's Own. And I was so happy to see how much has changed in nearly 100 years in 2025. But in A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf talks about the topic, women and fiction. And this essay is really kind of a stream of consciousness, a string of thoughts about all the different things that women and fiction can encompass during her time in the early 1900s. So what that means by the stream of consciousness is that when you kind of read this book, her thoughts just kind of move from one to the next. They chase rabbit trails, they come back around to one another. And this is the first time I've really read a book that was written in that style. I've heard that a lot of her writing is notorious for that, as well as other authors of this time. But I enjoyed it for this particular essay. And so the way she approached this idea of women and fiction is actually through a fictional character or persona named Mary Beaton, who is asked to tackle the task of women and fiction and must think about what that means. And she goes down so many rabbit trails. She first muses about all of the different things that women in fiction can encompass, starting with the history of women, or I should say, the lack thereof. In Virginia Woolf's time, there wasn't a lot of material written about women in history. And why? Well, because men wrote about history, and men wrote about what men care about, which is, of course, government and war and politics and political figures of that sort. They weren't necessarily documenting the domestic lives of women. And in history, what you find out about women is that a lot of them were not educated in the same way as men, if absolutely educated at all outside of domestic life. They were basically set to be wives and mothers, and that's the role that they performed. And as far as scholarly works, academic works, writing, poetry, that was kind of off limits to women in history until just a little bit before Virginia Woolf's time. She also muses on the idea of women in academics. So her fictional character, Mary Beaton, is kind of thinking and walking along the streets of Oxbridge, this fictional college that she's created, and she starts treading on the grass where women are not allowed to go, and a professor comes out and is telling her, hey, this is off limits for you, lady. What are you doing here? Basically, that's really paraphrased. And she starts to think, women aren't even invited into intellectual spaces still in her time. They were still mostly for men at that time. There were a few colleges that were permitting women to attend, but still not most. So in Virginia Woolf's time, women in academics and women being scholars was a problem with women's rights because there just weren't any. And because there weren't any women funding women to go into academics. And she kind of talks about this recycling of money that happens in men's academics. So these men who are raised in well-to-do families go off to school, who raise money for that school to bring more men from well-to-do families into the school, and so on and so forth. And women are just kind of excluded from that space in this time. So that was really interesting to think about. There was really a lack of women in history, written throughout history, women in academic spaces. And another thing she talks about, because at her time there were women writers, and there had been women writers, of course, people like Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, and Elizabeth Gaskell were all authors who were popular and were well known that predated Virginia Woolf. However, they were all novelists and they all wrote novels. And so Virginia Woolf kind of explores why some of these great female authors were novelists and why they didn't pursue other types of writing, because they could have pursued, history or nonfiction or poetry. But she says that their domestic setting works best for novels because women were kind of contained to their homes and the drawing room and their kitchen. And so they really could only see life through the visitors of their home and visiting others' homes. It's not like they traveled abroad or they had a really expanded education. They might have had a very minimal basic education based off of accomplishments, but it still wasn't to the same standard as men. So their realm of education only went so far, and maybe that's why women really only ever wrote novels before her time. She also muses about Shakespeare and is there going to be a next female Shakespeare? And then she kind of thinks about, if women have the creativity in them now, they probably had creativity in them in history as well. So if Shakespeare had a fictional sister who was just as talented, just as creative, she would not have had the same opportunity to be a Shakespeare because it would have been looked down upon. It would have been absolutely regarded as something like witchcraft. You would have been unweddable if you went for that kind of pursuit. It just would have really been discouraged and frowned upon, and she wouldn't have had the education to go to the same places that Shakespeare went. So it's interesting that you see, because history has excluded women, the present naturally just excludes women, and not necessarily in this angry feminist voice, I will say. As a conservative Christian woman, I really didn't read A Room of One's Own as some raging feminist manifesto. Of course, Virginia Woolf was upset at the discrepancy of women in literature and who wrote and in fiction, but she really tackles the subject with an almost humorous, sarcastic tone. So she takes something serious, but puts it in a way that just kind of lightens it down. It doesn't sound like she's just raging at men and like this is just all their fault. I didn't necessarily feel like this was a book that was degrading men, so I appreciated that. But it did point out a lot of the problems as to why women weren't writing. Women, in order to write, need basically two things: a living wage and a room of one's own, a space to isolate and be creative. So she talks about all of the ways that women in history either didn't have any money, didn't have access to money, or if they did, it was in their husband's charge. And this is just true. I remember reading last year Lucy Worsley's Jane Austen at Home, and just seeing how much lack of control Jane Austen had in her time over her property and her finances because she was a woman points out that this is true. You know, Jane Austen didn't write about women who got kicked out of their home from their brothers because it wasn't true and it didn't happen. It did. So women kind of lacked any property or any agency, and often if they did pursue a career, it was something like a governess or a nursemaid, which I will say Virginia Woolf at one point does argue, but is that not more necessary than some of these other occupations like writers and soldiers and so forth? So I appreciated that she still acknowledged that the role of a woman in the domestic setting is still good, it's still noble, it's still necessary. But for those women who don't get married, who don't have children, but they do have an inclination to writing, they need to be able to make a living wage from that, and they need to have a space to be creative. So if a woman wanted to write, she would have to go somewhere like a common place full of people. She didn't usually have like this access to a private space of her own, which is pretty necessary sometimes for creativity. I can speak to that. I am a mother of 3 young children, and while of course I can sit at the computer and write, and I do for fun, it is sometimes difficult. But I'm thankful in 2025 to have a husband who will watch the kids when I need a minute, which is another change throughout history. I feel like a lot of husbands are a lot more supportive of their wives' creative pursuits than perhaps they would have been. However, I also think it's important to note that it's just not always the case, because Jane Austen's father was incredibly supportive of her writing, and so was her brother. So you do have these small pockets of history that just aren't true of the stereotype. And I think that's important to talk about, because a lot in this book I did feel were kind of blanket, stereotypical statements about men's opportunities and women's lack thereof. And I think it's important to say that every case is individual. Jane Austen was an individual case who did have men around her who supported her. In 2025, a lot of women do have men surrounding them that would support them happily, but some still don't, and that tends to be a more individual, personal scenario versus just all men are oppressing all women. So, and I didn't really get the fact that Virginia Woolf was saying that. I don't think she was saying all men are just absolutely terrible, because there is a point that she argues that men and women just naturally bring different perspectives to their writing. So men are going to write about what's going on in history and current events through one lens of perspective, and perhaps if a woman joined in on that writing, it would be fresh and different. Kind of near the end of her essay, when she is imploring women and encouraging them to become writers, she says that, I'm just kind of getting bored with the material out there because I'm only ever reading from mostly a male perspective, which there's nothing wrong with, but in her time, a fresh perspective from more women would have been nice. So I'm really grateful to live in 2025 when women are really dominating in the writing sphere, I would say. Some of the best well-known authors ever are women. I think the most sold author next to Shakespeare is actually Agatha Christie, who is a female author that people are still reading her works today. So there's a lot to be said about women and fiction even now in 2025. I'm really thankful that we live in an age where women now have a public school education from the very beginning. They actually are encouraged to go and work and make a living wage, and they can stay at home if they want to, but often that's not the norm anymore. Most women are going out and taking careers, and they can write fiction if they want to. Now, like I mentioned, unlike in Virginia Woolf's times, I think whether women do choose to write fiction or not in 2025 really probably depends on her personal circumstances. So was she financially able to go to college? In 2025, women have access to go to college. They can go, they're admitted, they are permitted, but do they have the money? But that's true for men too. And in 2025, a woman has a choice to go to work or stay at home. I have a university bachelor's degree in agriculture, not in English or literature. And I did go to work after graduating, but once I became a mother, I wanted to stay home and homeschool, and that was my choice. And it's absolutely encouraged for me to pursue something creative like writing on the side if I want to, and I think that's a wonderful thing. But another woman may not have that opportunity if she doesn't have people around her that are supportive. But at least in 2025, women do have a lot more rights than they did in 1928. The sphere of fiction has just really changed. I would be interested to know what Virginia Woolf thinks of modern fiction or modern women's writing. What does she think of the subject matter? What does she think of the topics? Because so many of my classic books have Virginia Woolf's commentary on the writing, and I would be curious to know if she was happy with how far we've progressed almost 100 years later, or if she wished things were different. So all in all, I am glad that I decided to give Virginia Woolf a try. I didn't really know what to expect going into her writing. I didn't know if I would resonate or not resonate with what she had to say. But I think for her time, there was nothing she said that was wrong. I just think now it's a lot more personal and unique to an individual person's situation. And it's not always just women that might be oppressed financially, or with a time constraint, men could be too. You know, I'm not necessarily oppressed because I'm a wife and mother and I have to care for my children all the time, no more than my husband is oppressed for having to work 10 or 12-hour shifts every day. Both of us would struggle to find space and time in our schedule for solitude to write with our current life circumstances. So I think it's a bit unique for anyone and everyone, depending on where you live and what your life's like. But at the end of the day, I do think Virginia Woolf would be glad that women now, for the most part, do have a choice if they want to write. As a homeschool mom, my oldest, who is 6, who can now read and is writing a little bit, is writing and illustrating her own stories. And unlike Shakespeare's fictional sister in A Room of One's Own, that is encouraged. I am encouraging her, her father is encouraging her, and maybe something someday will come of it, or it won't. But the point is, she does have the option and the opportunity now, which is such a blessing. And I think Virginia Woolf would agree with that. So if you have read any of Virginia Woolf, please let me know in the comments below what you think and what you think about her writing, what you think about her fiction. I have never read any of her fiction. This is the very first book I've read by her, and I thought it was good food for thought. It's not necessarily a book that's going to go on my top 10 or top 25, but I'm glad I read it. It led me down a long rabbit trail for women in fiction in 2025 of thought, and it was interesting. So I'm glad I gave it a shot. Let me know in the comments below what you thought about it, if you've read it or if you plan to read it. And Lord willing, I will see y'all next time. Happy reading, friends.